أعوذ بالله الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والصلاة والسلام على أشرف المرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. So inshallah we will start with this first lecture of this summer school, despite the jet lag, despite you being tired also, I guess. So the first lecture is a kind of introduction to the issue of theology and ethics. And as you see in the title, Towards an Islamic Ethicotheology. So it's about theology and ethics and the intersection between them and how can theology articulate an ethical behavior. This is a big issue, and actually the issue of ethical theology is not something that I invent, but it's something that is old actually, and it has been initiated by Immanuel Kant, because Immanuel Kant died 1804, so 1804. He is a German philosopher, one of the philosophers of the Enlightenment, and he is a believer actually. He believes in God, but he saw in classical theology, he did not see in classical theology any solution or any jadwa, how do you call it? Any jadwa, any benefit. So for him, it should be replaced by something that is accurate and which is ethicotheology. So he says physical theology or physicotheology is an attempt by which reason tries to conclude the end of nature. So physicotheology, it was how he calls classical theology. Is an attempt by which reason tries to conclude the end of nature, which can only be known empirically, to the supreme cause of nature and the attributes of that cause. So basically, the classical way of doing theology, he thinks, is a way where reason tries to come to the conclusion of God, his existence, and his attributes by reflecting upon the creation. And then he says the attempt by which reason tries to conclude the moral end of the reasonable beings of nature, an end which may be known a priori, to this cause and its attributes would be moral theology. So moral theology is an attempt by which the reason tries to conclude the existence of God and his attributes by reflecting upon the human being and his moral behavior. Now, yes?
Is this from his critique of pure reason? Or what?
No, the critique of judgment.
Judgment. Oh.
Yes, critique of judgment. Sorry, I did not mention that. So, Kant thinks that, classical theology or physicotheology or speculative theology is not accurate anymore, or is not accurate. Of course, we have to understand it in the context in which he came, in a context where, of the Enlightenment, where rationality became to replace, religion, and he actually his attempt is trying to save actually theology from theology, trying to save theology from theology, which means that for him, speculative or physical theology is something that will give a reason to atheism to attack religion or to attack theology. He was not religious, but he thought that we should find an alternative way to think of God, and so he rejected physical or speculative theology for several reasons. One of the reasons is that, in physical theology or physicotheology, we are trying to conclude the existence of God and his attributes to reflect through reflection on the universe, but the problem is that according to Kant, the universe does not say anything about God and about his attributes. The universe does not tell us even though if it could eventually tell us that God exists, it does not tell us how God is and what does he precisely want. What are his objectives? Does he want good? Does he want bad, etc.? So this is one of the reasons. So the reflection on the universe does not define the purpose of the universe and the purpose of God. And if you don't know the purpose of God through the universe, then you cannot know who God is and what are his attributes. Is it a good God? Is it the ethical God, etc.? So this is the first reason. Another reason is the question of evil. If we reflect on the universe with mere reason, then we see that there is evil in the universe, and there are things that contradicts the perfect nature of God. That there are things that contradict the mercifulness of God, the goodness of God. So here, it's another reason to why Kant rejects, speculative theology or physical theology, because this theology cannot, or if we practice this theology, then we cannot conclude that God is perfect. We cannot conclude that God is merciful. We cannot conclude that God is good. And even though there is good, we can see that there is good in the universe. This good, according to Kant, is always relative to something else, and it's not absolute. So this is another reason why Kant rejects, physical theology. Another reason is that he says that we cannot induce the creation. We cannot know all the purposes of the creation. So the creation is huge. The universe is huge. And we cannot deduct that every element from the creation has a purpose. And of course, the question of purpose is central, because we can only know God and conclude his existence and know his attributes by defining the purpose of things, because then we know what God exactly is through what he wants. And we cannot define the purpose of every single element in the universe. We cannot know if every single element has a purpose and if every purpose is good, etc. And even like I said before, even if we can conclude some purposes from the universe, there are not absolute purposes. There are, physical purposes, which means that there are intermediary purposes and not the end purpose. And the last reason that we can, conclude from the reason why Kant rejects physical theology is that reflection upon the universe will not permit us to know things as they are. So our faculties, according to Kant, are limited. Our ability to know things is limited. So we are thinking within a certain standard. We think in terms of weight and in terms of size and etc. So and the things of universe go way beyond that. So our faculties of understanding things are limited, while the creation goes way beyond that. So, which means, according to Kant, that we cannot know really the purpose of things. We can know the phenomena, the phénomène in French, and not the new man. And which means that, according to Kant, ontology is impossible. So ontology is impossible. We cannot know the deep nature of things. So theological reflection upon universe will not enable us to create a theology, because it will not enable us to understand things as they really are. So those are the reasons why Kant rejects physical theology, the limits of physical theology according to Kant. So here he says, I claim that physical theology, so far as it can be pushed, cannot teach us anything about the ultimate goal of creation, because it does not even touch this question. It may well justify the concept of an intelligent cause of the world, if it is only a purely subjective concept, or relating to the nature of our ability to know, to the possibility of things that we can understand at the moment. But it does not further determine this concept either from a theoretical point of view or from a practical point of view, and it does not reach the goal of its efforts, which is to found a theology, but it is never anything but a physical theology. Indeed, it does not consider and must not consider the relation of ends only as a conditional or dependent on nature. And therefore there can be no question of the end for which nature itself exists and whose principle must be sought outside of nature. And yet it is on the determinate idea of this end that the concept of the supreme and intelligent cause of the world rests, and consequently the possibility of theology. So the only way to create a theology is to know the end, the final goal of the universe. And we cannot know what is the final goal of the universe, of the elements of the universe, by reflecting upon the universe according to Kant, for the reason I just mentioned. And a theology can only be based on this, because we can understand who God is by knowing what He wants, through all the things that He created, through everything, what He exactly wants. And by this end purpose, we can know who God is. If He wants good, if this is the end purpose, then He is almighty, then He is good, etc., etc. So here, this is why, again, Kant rejects classical theology or physical theology. So for him, the alternative must be moral or practical theology, or as he called it also, ethico-theology. So the only thing that can indicate the ultimate purpose of God is the human being, according to Kant. And this is ethical theology, is the reflection upon the human being and human ethical behavior, because this is the only way to know the ultimate purpose of everything that God has created and everything that God has done. So the ethical dimension within the human being, this is, according to Kant, the end purpose of the whole creation. The whole creation, everything that God did, is there to enable the human being to have an ethical behavior. So, Kant, he differentiated between the practical reason and theoretical reason. Theoretical reason is science, natural science. That is the theoretical reason. So for him, the theoretical reason, or science, cannot prove the existence of God. We cannot prove that God exists, and we cannot know Him, according to Kant, through science, so through the reflection upon the universe, through the theoretical reason, for the reasons I mentioned. But we can know Him through the practical reason, and this is ethico-theology. And the practical reason is the fact that we can observe within the human being an aspiration for ethics. And this is practical theology because this is something that we can see in the practice of human being. And it's ethico-theology because this is something that is related to the ethical, nature of human being. So here, this is the only way, according to Kant, to know God and who He is and to prove His existence. But this proof is not scientific for Kant, because we cannot prove it scientifically. Even though we know that it is, we can observe it in the behavior. We can observe it practically in human behavior, but according to Kant, we cannot prove it scientifically. We cannot prove it. So, this is what Kant called the ethical imperative. This is the ethical imperative according to Kant. So, if we place the final objective of creation in the human being and in his ethical behavior according to Kant, then we can relate everything in one harmonious system, and then we can look at the world as one entity of ends that all comes together in the human being. So the final end is a human being and his ethical behavior, and in this way we can know God, and we can know that He is perfect, we can know that He is good, we can know that He is merciful, etc., because we see it in this ethical imperative within human being. And so from this, according to Kant, this is the way to develop a theology, or this is the only way to develop a true theology, according to Kant. And one example of that ethical evidence of the existence of God, and even of the existence of a hereafter, etc., is the fact, according to Kant, of not believing in God is actually a transgression of ethics, because we can observe through the practical reason that human being aspires to ethics, aspires to the good, to doing good and loving good and hating evil and avoiding evil. So it's impossible that there is no consequence of that aspiration here in this life and in the hereafter. Because we know that everything that the human being aspires for has a concrete response in reality. The human being aspires, for instance, for food, and there is a concrete response for that aspiration in reality. The human being aspires for love, for instance, and there is a concrete response for that in the reality. And so how can human being aspire for ethics, for the good, for justice, without that there is something concrete in the reality responding to that aspiration? So this is a moral proof of the existence of God, because, and of the existence even of the hereafter, because, for instance, when human being aspires for justice, it's impossible that there is nothing, and a human being aspires for absolute justice, it's impossible that there is nothing answering in the concrete reality to that aspiration. And we see, for instance, that there is no absolute justice here in this life, which means that there must be another life where there is absolute justice responding to that particular aspiration of human being. So this is a little bit, how Kant, see an alternative for the classical theology, which he tried to save actually from the Enlightenment, that came actually as a flow, against religion, and he was a believer. So this was a way actually to integrate, belief within this new paradigm. Also, of course, I will not go through all the critiques that Kant had on classical theology, but one of the issues is that he was also blaming speculative, how do you say it? Speculative theology or physical theology. He was blaming them and showing that it's not accurate. And he said that, this kind of reflection on the universe led those theologians to ignore or to refute the ethical nature or the ethical essence of universe. Because when they saw that there is evil, the question of evil is addressed by, I think, in theology, theosity. When they saw that there is this evil in the universe, they denied the universe from ethics, or they denied that universe was built upon ethics, because so they said that the universe has no ethical purpose, because they saw that there is bad, there's good, and there's evil. And this is something that Kant critiqued, and he said that is one of the consequences of physical theology, or of reflecting rationally on the creation, to try to deduct, or try to develop a theology. Now, why I'm talking about Kant? I'm just talking about the concept of ethical theology. Of course, after Kant, Kant was not, he believed, but he was not religious. He was not, adhering to any of the religions. But in the Christian tradition, ethical theology or practical theology developed into, a whole discipline of, trying to articulating theology in practical behavior. So the purpose of this introduction is just, to give you the background of this term ethical theology, and not to say that, Islamic ethical theology should be something, that relates to what Kant, was aiming at, by this term ethical theology. So let's move from Kant to Ibn Taymiyya. Of course, a big switch. Ibn Taymiyya, as you know, he's a scholar from the early 8th century, and the reason why we will talk about Ibn Taymiyya is that Ibn Taymiyya actually, and we will talk about it tomorrow. One of the lectures that we will handle tomorrow is about Ibn Taymiyya's epistemological revolution. He is somebody who critiqued all the schools of theology, all the Islamic schools of theology, and this is also a critique that he addressed to the speculative theology. One of the critiques that he addressed to the speculative theology is, the absence of the ethical dimension in speculative theology. So we will try to see how Ibn Taymiyya critiques, the history of Islamic theology, because the purpose of this presentation, we said that it's towards an Islamic ethical theology, is to say that in the Islamic tradition there is a problem on the level of theology where, often the ethical dimension is absent. And this is why we said towards an Islamic ethical theology is that, the Islamic schools of theology, for reasons that we will mention, inshallah, actually they often dismissed ethics, and they did not develop a practical theology. They did not develop a theology that will articulate in human life, that will articulate in all the domains of human practice. But their theology is a mere speculative theology that is just replying on opponents, like we will see. But I did not want to go through the history of Islamic theology and see where, where the deficiencies are, but I just wanted to illustrate this history throughout, the critique of Ibn Taymiyya. So Ibn Taymiyya, of course, like I said, he critiqued all the trends of Islamic theology, because actually Ibn Taymiyya was thinking that Greek philosophy was the biggest disaster that has occurred in Islamic thought. he thought that it's because of Greek theology that the Muslims actually divided into different, of one of the main reasons that the Muslim divided on the level of the thought in different groups. And one of the main reasons also, according to Ibn Taymiyya, why the Muslims turned their back from the revelation. Those groups, those ethical currents turned their back on revelation. And according to Ibn Taymiyya, Greek philosophy has divided Muslims on the intellectual level, at least on the level of theology, in four main groups. Those are the philosophers, the Mu'tazilis, the scholars of Hadith and Fiqh, and speculative theologians. Now you know that in very early Islamic history, when Islam spread, into different lands in Iraq and Persia and Egypt and Syria, all of those countries actually, the Greek philosophy was very present over there. Even in the Christian tradition, the epistemological frame actually was the Greek tradition, even within the Christian tradition. So when the Islam spread in those countries, of course, Muslim came in touch with the Greek philosophy very early, already at the end of the first century, and there was a movement of translation, translating those philosophical works into Arabic, and actually the first who adopted Greek philosophy as such were a lot of those who translated it to Arabic. And in that way, philosophy started to infiltrating Islamic thought, and so we had philosophers that adopted Greek philosophy as it is and just rejected Islam and rejected Sharia, and we have different examples of that. And so Ibn Taymiyyah here, of course, he criticizes the philosophers, and he says that the issue of we are talking about the Muslim philosophers. Their issue is that they are saying that the Quran did only come with a discursive approach, bayani, which means that the Quran did not come with actually with an epistemology, with a way of thinking, with a way of rationalizing on text and on the universe, but it comes with just a discursive approach, only texts that are just giving information that does not go beyond the very information that it contains. And so according to Ibn Taymiyyah also, philosophers think that they are the only rationalists, and that they are the only one who have the rational evidence, and in that way, actually, the Muslim philosophers, they turn their back, on revelation. Then we had the Mu'tazilas. Of course, the Mu'tazilas, they came as a response to the philosophers. They came to defend Islam against the philosophers who adopted. Some of the philosophers just rejected Sharia and adopted philosophy as it is. Others, they tried to interpret Sharia in order to adapt it to philosophy, which means that they adopted the philosophical frame of philosophy as a frame of reference, and then they just took Sharia and tried to fit it into this frame. Their frame, their epistemology was a Greek epistemology, and then they took Sharia just and adopted it within this frame. While the Mu'tazilis, when they came, they tried to counter this phenomena and reply to those philosophers and defend, Islam, defend Sharia. But the critique of Ibn Taymiyya here towards the Mu'tazila, he said that when trying to do this, actually they created their own epistemology, because they went on to try to reply on philosophers. They went on their ground. They went on their ground, and actually they created an epistemology. They created a way of reasoning, actually that was not coming from the revelation, and they submitted revelation to this new way of thinking. He called this. So he says, I can quote him if you want. فهم الذين يقدمون قضايا عقلية نظرية مختلط فيها الحق والباطل ويجعلونها الأصل الذي يحكمون به على غيره. So they have a set of rational tools, rational issues, where truth is mixed with the false, which means that it's a kind of hybrid epistemology. It's not 100% Greek. It's not 100% from the revelation, but it's a hybrid epistemology to which they submit revelation. And فينقلب الوحي لديهم محكوما عليه. So revelation becomes submitted to this new epistemology that they have created from outside revelation. And so they were influenced by philosophy, and they adopted a similar approach in the sense that they did not create an epistemology, a way of reasoning out of revelation. And so this was basically the critique of Ibn Taymiyyah towards Mu'tazila. And of course, at the same time when this occurred, historically speaking, in Mu'tazila, we had also the scholars of hadith and the fiqh. And so these are the third category that Ibn Taymiyyah criticizes, the scholars of hadith and fiqh. So when this phenomena occurred, those scholars came and tried to reply to both philosophers and Mu'tazilas. And I quote Ibn Taymiyyah again. He says about scholars of hadith and fiqh: لما رأوا ما في كلام المعتزلة من مخالفة للوحي صنفوا من الكتب ما يثبتون به وجوب التمسك بالكتاب والسنة، لكنهم لم يحسنوا في الاستدلال على المطلوب، فإنهم يستدلون بالقرآن من جهة إخباره لا من جهة دلالته. So he says when the scholars of hadith and fiqh saw this phenomena. So here when Ibn Taymiyyah is talking about the scholars of hadith and fiqh, he's not talking about the first scholars like Imam Ahmed bin Hanbal or Malik, etc. He's talking about those who came after the first generations, al-Athariyun, basically, who came after the first generations. He said when they saw what al-Mu'tazila did and what they have developed, the thought they have developed that is going against revelation, they wrote books to show that we must abide by the Quran and the Sunnah. But they did not succeed in al-istidlal, in argumenting what they should argument for. And he said, يستدلون بالقرآن من جهة إخباره لا من جهة دلالته. They use the Quran to argument from the information that it contains, and not from the proof it contains, which means that they looked at the Quran as a discursive system and not as a they did not go further than the information that is contained in the Quran, and they did not try to develop from the Quran an epistemology or a way of reasoning which is able to produce knowledge, to produce a discourse that is competing with the discourse that was or the thought that was produced by the Mu'tazila, because Mu'tazila, they had their own epistemology, their own way of reasoning that is producing thought. But what the scholars of hadith and fiqh did, they did not produce thought, and they did not produce an Quranic philosophy, but they just took the Quran and the Sunnah, and they just took from it what is just the information that is contained in it, and not the rationale or the way that a way of reasoning, a philosophy that is coming from the Quran, or an epistemology that is coming from the Quran. So, yes?
Could that also be like an argument from authority, or is that different?
What do you mean?
Like they're using the Quran as an authority to argue, not going further than the discourse analysis.
Yeah, so the issue is that they use the Quran just to reply to the Mu'tazila by what the Quran literally contains, and not by the way it's by the rationale or the way of reasoning which is contained in the Quran, which means that they cannot produce a thought out of this, because their discourse is limited to the very information that is contained in it, and not it's not an epistemology that can produce discourses that is competing with what Mu'tazila were doing. So they did not take the revelation to develop an argumentation of an rational argumentation of theology. And then Ibn Taymiyya, he says, فَذَمَّهُمْ أُولَٰئِكَ. So that is why the Mu'tazila, they blame them, they blame the people of hadith and fiqh, وَنَسَبُوهُمْ إِلَى الْجَهْلِ إِذْ لَمْ يَذْكُرُوا الْأُصُولَ الدَّالَّةَ عَلَى صِدْقِ الرَّسُولِ. So this created a problem with the Mu'tazila, because they blamed the people of hadith and fiqh because they did not mention the proofs and the evidence of Islamic creed. And at the same time, people of hadith and fiqh, they said that the Mu'tazila were in the bid'ah, because they developed a rationale or a way of reasoning that is against revelation. And then Ibn Taymiyya says, وَالطَّائِفَتَانِ يَلْحَقُهُمَا الْمَلَامِ. And both of them are to be blamed. لكونهما أعرضتا عن الأصول التي بينها الله, because both of them actually they turn their back on the foundations, on the rational foundations that God has established. And Ibn Taymiyya says this is the reason why actually the conflict occurred between both, between Mu'tazila and people of hadith and fiqh. And actually Ibn Taymiyya, we are still speaking about scholars of hadith and fiqh. Actually Ibn Taymiyya thinks that the scholars of hadith and fiqh, which means the athariyun that came after the first generation, actually they did not follow the salaf, because he thinks that the salaf, the first three generations, they used reason, they used rationality, they used a rationality that is coming from revelation to establish creed and establish theology. While the people of hadith and fiqh that came after, it's like they rejected the fact that you can develop a philosophy out of revelation and beyond the very letter of revelation. And he gave I can quote him again. He says ظن طوائف من عامة أهل الحديث والفقه والتصوف أنه لا يتكلم في أصول الدين أو لا يتكلم في باب الصفات بالقياس العقلي قط. So different groups of the people of hadith and fiqh and Sufism were thinking that you cannot talk about usul al-din, so about creed, or talk about divine attributes based on rational analogy. You cannot never talk about those issues based on rational analogy, and that is a bid'ah. So he's blaming them from that for that. وكان هذا مما أطمع الأولين فيهم. So this is the reason why the Mu'tazila actually they gave this space to the Mu'tazila to do it. And then he says that this was not the way Salaf approached things, and this is not the way the Salaf were thinking. And then he gives an example from Imam Ahmed, which is from the Salaf, from the third generation. He says, فسلك الإمام أحمد وغيره من الاستدلال بالنصوص والإجماع مسلك الاستدلال بالفطرة والأقيسة العقلية الصحيحة. So he said Imam Ahmed and other scholars, besides using the proofs of the texts and the consensus, they followed other approaches which consisted of reasoning on the base of fitra and rational deduction. And then he gave an example. And he gave the example of impurity in Islam. Why is impurity, najasa, why is it bad? He says, as argued by Imam Ahmed, it's bad because it's going against the fitrah. Because the human being in his fitrah, in his innate nature, he is pure. God's insufflated into him this spirit from God, and it's a pure spirit. He's created according to the fitrah. And actually this pure spirit that a human being has is mirroring one divine attribute, because Allah is al-Quddus, which means is the pure. One of the divine attributes of God is that He is the pure. And this is why God cannot unify with His creation, because in His creation there is impurity. And this is reflected in human nature, because human nature at the end of the day, the fitrah, is a set of elements that are reflecting God's nature. Like I said before, human aspires to justice and God is just. Human aspires to beauty and God is the beautiful, etc. So the fact that Islam prohibited najasa and asked human beings to stay away from najasa, this is something that is actually going along with who the human is. And being, how do you say it? Being not clean, being, having najasa, it goes against who you are as a human being. And doing wudu, doing tahara, it goes along with who you are as a human being. So this is going back to the fitrah. And this is so an argumentation that was used by, according to Ibn Taymiyya, by Imam Ahmed to prove why Islam, has imposed onto us, to purify ourselves, etc. So in this way, Ibn Taymiyya tries to demonstrate that those scholars of hadith and fiqh that are pretending, to defend the Quran and defend the Sunnah actually are going against the Quran and Sunnah by denying the Quran of Sunnah of a rationality, a philosophy that is, which can, produce a discourse that go beyond the very letter of the text, like we just demonstrated about fitrah and this actually also goes back to what we said about ethical theology, the reflection upon human nature, to know who God is, etc. So, and then the last group is the speculative theologians, the Ash'arites and the Maturidis. And he says, فَإِنَّهُمْ لَمَّا لَاحَظُوا تَفْرِيطَ هؤلاء وتعدي أولئك, when those, so the Ash'aris, for those of you who don't know, so the Ash'aris are a school of theology, an Islamic school of thought that occurred in the 4th century, and the leader of it is Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. And Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, actually, he was first a Mu'tazili himself, because his father-in-law was one of the main leaders of the Mu'tazilis. And then he reconverted to Sunnism, and he started to fighting Mu'tazilis, and he wrote a book which is called استحسان علم الكلام. Because before Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari, the scholars of Sunnah said that علم الكلام, so speculative, how do you pronounce it? Speculative theology is haram. They wrote تحريم وعلم الكلام, or those kind of books. It's haram actually to go into speculative theology. Because the Mu'tazilites were doing speculative theology, reasoning upon divine attributes, upon God with with mantiq and with logics, etc. And this was haram before Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari. And Abu al-Hasan al-Ash'ari was the first Sunni scholar who said that it's an obligation. He wrote استحسان علم الكلام. And then from then on, Sunnis also started to perform and to develop speculative theology, and this is how the Ash'ari school was developed, and then it became the main trend within Sunnism. The main trend within Sunnism was Ash'arism, and then also Maturidism, which is very actually similar, very close to Ash'arism. And those are also actually Ibn Taymiyya. He criticized Ash'arism. The main critique in all his books that was addressed by Ibn Taymiyya was to Ash'aris, not to Shi'is or not to Mu'tazilis or not to other sects, but to Ash'aris especially. Why? Because before that, at a certain point of time, the main trend within Sunnism was not the Ash'arism, was like I said, the Atharism or the Hanbalism. And I'm not talking about fiqh, I'm talking about theology. The main theological trend was the trend of Hanbalism or Atharism. And then in Ibn Taymiyya's era, they became the major trend. And this is why Ibn Taymiyyah, he wrote extensively to reply onto them. For instance, this book بيان تلبيس الجهمية في تأسيس بدعهم الكلامية. This is a main work of Ibn Taymiyyah where he is especially replying to Ash'arites. And his critique to Ash'arism is that he said, when they came, so they came after Mu'tazilis and after this tensions between Mu'tazilites and Sunnis, and especially scholars of Hadith and scholars of fiqh, the Ash'aris then came, and he said فإنهم لما لاحظوا تفريط هؤلاء وتعدي أولئك, when they observed that those are neglectant, and those are abusing. So the people of Hadith and fiqh, they are neglecting the Islamic philosophy, Islamic epistemology, and those are abusing, transgressing revelation. When the Ash'aris came and they saw this, they diverged with both of them. And they said about Mu'tazila, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, وقالوا عن المعتزلة إن طريقتهم ضارة وأن السلف لم يسلكوها. The way of Mu'tazila, the approach of Mu'tazila is dangerous, and this is not the way of the Salaf did. But the issue is, according to Ibn Taymiyyah, when the Ash'arites came to reply to the Mu'tazilites, they adopted the same approach. They adopted the same approach, which is to the fact that they created also an epistemology that was not coming from revelation. They came to defend revelation, but actually they created also a hybrid epistemology that was not totally Islamic, totally from revelation, and not totally also from Greek philosophy, but it's a hybrid epistemology. And actually they ended up resembling to the Mu'tazilites in the sense that they created an epistemology to which they submitted the revelation also. But of course in a lesser degree than the Mu'tazilites. So they did not use the Quran as a source, and they did not develop an Quranic epistemology which is able to produce knowledge, and produce, a theology that is properly Quranic according to Ibn Taymiyya. And so actually at the end of the day, according to Ibn Taymiyya, all of them, they turn their back to the Quran. All of those groups, according to Ibn Taymiyya, they turn their back to the Quran because the philosophers and the Mu'tazilis and the speculative theologians, they did not adopt a Quranic epistemology, but also the scholars of Hadith and Fiqh, they tried just to defend the texts, but they turned their back to the Quran and Sunnah because they did not use the Quran and Sunnah as an rational, method or approach, or they did not develop a Quranic epistemology to reply to the others, and this is why, according to Taymiyya, all of them, they turn their back to revelation. So speculative theology or physical theology, according to Ibn Taymiyya, is not a solution, because once again, it did not develop an Islamic epistemology and an Islamic way of reasoning. So it's clear that Ibn Taymiyya was not against rationalism, but he was against, or he was thinking that we should develop an Islamic rationalism, coming, or authentically, Islamic, coming from revelation, and not as those school of thought did, hybrid rationality that was not, taking the Quran as foundation. And actually, speculative theology is not a real theology, because speculative theology, historically speaking, ilm al-kalam, the only purpose of speculative theology in Islam was to reply to other groups. It was not to develop, an Islamic view on, what God is and how this would articulate in human behavior, how this would articulate in human life. And the proof of this is that those speculative theology themselves, they admit this. For instance, Al-Ghazali, he called his book on one of his books on speculative theology, Al-Jam al-Awam an Ilm al-Kalam, which means Al-Jam, how do you translate this in English? Stopping, or silencing common people from speculative theology. So which means that, according to him and other speculative theologians, common people should not even read speculative theology, because this is not meant for everybody. It's just meant to reply on the opponents, and which means that actually it's useless for common people in daily life, because it's not developing a theology which, direct human action and which give you a conception of, what God is, etc. It's only replying to those opponents with their own tools, and so it's not accurate to develop theology. And also scriptural theology, according to Ibn Taymiyya, is not at a level, because we saw it before. It's only reiterating what is in the text, what God says. If God says He is in the heaven, fi sama, in the sky, then we just reiterate it and just confirm it, and not developing, beyond that, a way of reasoning, a way of thinking, a way of, addressing issues through that theology. So it's also problematic. The epistemological reconciliation of scriptural, physical, and ethical theology in Ibn Taymiyya's theology, of course, Ibn Taymiyya tried to come, like I said before, what he did is really an epistemological revolution, because he took all the Islamic, tradition, Islamic legacy, and especially on the level of theology, and tried to criticize this and reconstruct it on the right epistemological basis. And we will see it in the lecture of tomorrow, inshallah. But so he tried to reconcile the scriptural, physical, and ethical theology. because as we saw in Kant's approach, for him in theology there is no space for reflection on the text. There is no scriptural theology for Kant, and there is no, and it's not accurate also to reflect on the universe to develop theology, as we saw. But the only way is to reflect on human being and his ethical behavior. While Ibn Taymiyya actually tried to reconcile the three of them. So developing from the text a theology which is a theology that goes beyond what is said in the text to be an epistemological way of producing knowledge, al-burhan, of producing evidence. And also, he gave a particular place in theology to the universe, as we will see tomorrow, because he was thinking that the universe actually contains an ethical dimension, and he tried to solve the problem of the evil as it was presented by the Ash'arites, because the Ash'arites, they denied that the universe has a role to play in theology. Because for them the universe is neutral, does not say anything about God. And because of this very fact of evil in the universe, because there is evil in the universe, they came to the conclusion that actually the universe is neutral and there is no evil. So for instance, killing is evil according to revelation, but not according to the universe, because intrinsically killing or not killing is the same, because there is no value in the universe. Worshipping different gods or worshipping one God is actually the same thing, and they say it explicitly, it's the same thing. But why we think that worshipping one God is good and worshipping different God is bad? Because God has said it. So ethics, good and bad, is a value that God has al-faha, that God has added or attributed to things subjectively. But objectively in the universe, there is no good or evil, because this is the way they solve this problem of good and evil. So now you cannot say that God is evil because there is killings, there are disasters. You cannot say this, because those killings and those disasters has no value. And so Ibn Taymiyya, he tried to reconcile the ethical value of the universe and the ethical value of the fitra with the text, and try to reconcile this in an alternative epistemology. So he tried to develop a Quranic rationality out of these elements. And so he like we will see tomorrow, he took fitra and the universe as a way of proving, and as a way of argumenting on theological issues. Like we gave the example of, the tahara of the how do you call it, the purity. Yes. So we will tackle this inshallah in detail tomorrow. So now why I give we talked about Ibn Taymiyya. Like I said, the purpose here was to give you an idea about theology, historically speaking, how theology developed. Of course, we have to put things in the right historical context, and even Ibn Taymiyya, this is what he does when he's criticizing Ash'arites, because Ash'arites, they came and they were forced to replying to Mu'tazilites, and they were forced, to adapt a certain approach in order to be able to reply to Mu'tazilites. So, and in this way, actually, they managed to defend Sunnism. They were the main, actually, in a period of time. They were the main trend in Sunnism, and they were the ones who managed to counter, these other trends like Mu'tazilism and other trends. So we have to consider this historically speaking, and not to put the blame on Mu'tazila, on Ash'arites, that they distorted, Islamic epistemology or something like that. We have to put this into this context, but we have to take into account that this context end up with the fact that there was a distortion in Islamic epistemology that we'll talk about also later, inshallah. So, and this distortion actually in Islamic epistemology ended up in also distortion in some aspects of Islamic methodology also, and we will talk about it also. And this is why it's needed today. This is why we called our lecture towards an Islamic Ethicotheology. This is why today it's needed to put ethics back at the center of theology, because for historical reasons, ethics actually was put aside, was put at the margin of theology. Now, Quranic ethical theology, genealogy of Islamic ethics. What we will try to do here is to demonstrate, more or less, the place and how ethics actually, the place of ethics in revelation, the source of ethics, and how ethics actually articulate in revelation, in order to be able to assess Islamic disciplines, Islamic sciences, and Islamic thought from an ethical point of view, because this is actually going back to the ontology of ethics in revelation in order to assess, Islamic thought throughout this ontological or throughout this genealogy of Islamic ethics. You understand the jet lag through my to my speech, of course. Okay, so to do that, to try to figure out the place of Islamic ethics in revelation, we will try to see or to have a look at the works of one of the how do you say it, Islamologues, one of the a Japanese, Islamologue, how do you call it? Islamologist, who is Toshiko Izutsu.
It's Islamolog in Dutch. So
Yeah, I'm trying to translate. So Toshiko Izutsu died in 1993. Is a Japanese specialist of Islam, and especially he is one of the main pioneers of Islamic ethical concepts in the Quran. He wrote different books in this regard. One of his main books is Ethico-Religious Concepts in the Quran. And according to him, there are 3 categories of ethical concepts in the Quran. First category are concepts relating to the ethical nature of God, which he called divine ethics. And this category is addressed by, according to Izutsu, is addressed by speculative theologians, so addressed by the discipline of Aqidah, the discipline of theology in Islamic history. And then we have concepts relating to the ethical relationship between God and humans, and this is what Izutsu calls ethico-religious concepts. And this category belongs to human ethics. And then the last category is ethical concepts related. The second category is addressed, according to Izutsu, by tasawwuf, by the discipline of Sufism or mysticism. And then we have ethical concepts related to social relations. And this is what Izutsu called social ethics. So the B and the C are human ethics, and the A is divine ethics according to Izutsu. And the third category is addressed by which discipline? Is addressed by the fiqh. So those are the three main categories of ethical concepts. All the ethical concepts in the Quran can be categorized under one of those three categories according to Izutsu. We can use this categorization of Izutsu and try to categorize it slightly differently by saying we have divine ethics, we have spiritual or innate ethics, and we have applied or practical ethics. And this is based, of course, like you know, on the hadith Jibril, you know, the hadith of Gabriel when he came to the Prophet ﷺ, and where, you know, the Prophet showed us or taught us that Islam is constituted out of three main elements that are Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. So Iman is a divine will related to human conception or human belief, what we should believe in, the divine will related to what human should believe in. And Ihsan is the divine will related to human spiritual status. In which spiritual status does God want us to be? And Islam is the divine will related to human behavior or action, which human action wants God that human adopt. So the first is divine ethics, and the two, the B and the C, are human ethics. So as you see, according to this categorization, the one of Izutsu, the whole Islamic religion revolves around ethics. Everything is ethics. Because like the Prophet ﷺ has taught us, Islamic religion consists of three main axes or three main elements: Iman, Islam, and Ihsan. And there is no single verse in the Quran or single hadith or single principle or single ruling in Islam that does not fit into one of those three components. Everything fits within those three components. And if we say that those three components relates to ethics, whether divine ethics or spiritual ethics or applied ethics, that will mean that Islam as a religion is synonymous to ethics. Because we have divine ethics, which is ethics, we'll see it later, ethics as a manifestation, and spiritual ethics, which is a compliance to that manifestation of ethics, a human compliance to that manifestation of ethics, and applied ethics, which is a practical articulation or realization of that ethics. Now we can see in the Quran that those three ethical concepts, those three main ethical concepts, are interdependent and interrelated, which means that we cannot have one without the other. We cannot have one of those ethical concepts existing without the other. For instance, the Quran tells us those who from the fear of their Lord are penetrated, إِنَّ الَّذِينَ هُمْ مِنْ خَشْيَةِ رَبِّهِمْ مُشْفِقُونَ. Here we have the concept of ihsan. Who believe in the verses of their Lord, here we have the concept of iman. Who do not associate anything with their Lord, here we have the concept of Islam. So this is the verse 557 and 59 of Surah Al-Mu'minun. And then those verses continue. Who give what they give, so they give their they give their money, in charity. So this is Islam, because this is the practical behavior. While their hearts are full of fear, وَقُلُوبُهُمْ وَجِلَةٌ, this is ihsan, this is a spiritual status. While they're to the thought that they must return to their Lord, this is iman, this is an intellectual belief. So here we see how the three are interconnected and cannot exist without the other. So they give charity while their hearts are full of fear, their hearts are trembling. So it is a spiritual status that give birth to a practical behavior, practical ethical behavior. To the thought that they must return to the Lord. But the spiritual status is activated by what? By a thought, by a belief. The belief that they will return to the Lord. You see, those three are interdependent. Belief activates a spiritual status, activates a human faculty, which in turn will create ethical behavior. So one cannot exist without the other. We cannot have, according to Islam, an ethical behavior that is not, or we cannot have a spiritual status that is not coming from belief, and we cannot have real belief that is not creating a spiritual status, and that is not giving or producing an ethical behavior. The three are interrelated. These rush to good deeds and are the first to perform them. So the ethical behavior actually occurs from the interrelation of those three elements. So human ethics is merely a reflection or a very imperfect consequence of God's ethical nature, or a response to his ethical action. So according to the Quran, human ethics, so the B and the C, is only a reflection or imperfect consequence of God's ethical nature or response to his ethical action. So human must behave ethically because God is ethical in nature and human must follow that ideal, or because God has an ethical action toward human being. So the human also should have an ethical action towards others. And this is what we can find, of course, throughout the Quran. For instance, for the first part, so God's ethical nature, the verse says, "Those who spend their wealth in the way of Allah and then do not follow up what they have spent with reminders of it, or other harm will have their reward with the Lord, and there will be no fear concerning them, nor will they grieve. Kind speech and forgiveness are better than charity followed by harm. And Allah is rich and indulgent. O who you believe, do not invalidate your charities with reminders or harm." So here, how does this verse reflect the fact that God is ethical in nature, so human beings should also be ethical in nature? For those of you who are not sleeping. So here the verse tells us that, or asks human being to not follow up what they have spent as charity with reminders of it or other harm. So if you spend charity, you should not remind the one who you spend charity to that you have give it to him, or you should not harm him or look down at him because you are giving him charity. And you should have a kind speech toward him and be forgiveful, even though he may, have caused you something. You should forgive him. Why you should do this? Because Allah is rich and indulgent. Allah is rich, so He gives His charity, He gives what He has, while being indulgent, and He forgives. And He does not remind you of it. So this is the way you should behave also. So you should behave this way. You should be indulgent, and you should be because God is richer than you, and He is still indulgent. So you should follow this. And so here it's an example how human ethics is actually a consequence of divine ethics, or a consequence of God's ethical nature. So here we see that divine ethics is a manifestation of ethics as an origin. Ethics comes from God. And spiritual or innate ethics is the fact to comply to this ethics as a recipient, as a human being. And practical ethics is the fact to apply ethics as a concrete reality. And all of this, of course, is related to the concept of Iman. Here is an example of how human ethics is a consequence of God's ethical action. And the verse says, "And let not those of virtue amongst you and wealth swear not to give aid to their relatives and the needy and the immigrants for the cause of Allah, and let them pardon and overlook. Would you not like that Allah should forgive you, and Allah is forgiving and merciful?" So Allah in this verse tell people to forgive. So not here, the context of this verse, you may know it, is when Aisha radiallahu anha, the wife of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, she was accused of adultery, and one of those who contributed, to spreading this rumor, was one that was a poor person, and Abu Bakr, the father of Aisha, was taking care of him and giving him money. And then he swore not to give him anymore because he was upset of what he said about his daughter. And then this verse was revealed, and Allah was saying, basically, to Abu Bakr, but to everybody, that you should not swear not to give to the relatives and to the poor people, and you should pardon and overlook. You should forgive and overlook. Why? Because Allah is forgiving and merciful. So here Allah is ethical towards you. He forgives you and He's merciful towards you. So this is the way you should be towards other people. So here an example of how human ethics is only a consequence of divine ethics once again, or divine ethical action. Divine ethics, al-Iman, encompasses the three dimensions. So semantically, no major concept in the Quran exists independently of the concept of God. All the ethical concepts in the Quran relate in a way or in another to the concept of Iman, to the concept of belief in God. So belief in God actually encompasses all the ethical concepts. For instance, here a verse that says, the true believers, here we have the concept of Iman, are those whose hearts shudder. Here we have the concept of Ihsan, the spiritual status, when Allah is mentioned. And when His verses are recited to them, it increases their faith. So here again we have the concept of Iman. And they place their trust into their Lord. Here again we have the spiritual status of placing the trust into Allah, so ihsan. Those who perform the salat, concept of Islam, who spend in the path of Allah of what we have attributed to them, the concept of Islam, those are the true believers. The true believers, so the true belief, the true Iman is actually consists of the three dimensions. To believe in God, to have the spiritual status, and to have an ethical behavior. So we see that divine ethics is encompassing all the dimensions. You cannot be a true believer according to the Quran if you don't have the spiritual status and if you don't have an ethical behavior. And we see here that the verse ends with a social ethical behavior, which is spending in the path of Allah. This is a social ethical behavior, which means that at the end of the day, the final objective is to have a social ethics. Another verse is saying, certainly will the believers have succeeded. So قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, here the concept of iman. They who are during their prayer devoted in contemplation, here we have concept of ihsan. And they who turn away from ill speech, this is practical ethical behavior, so a concept of Islam. And they who are observant of zakat, again the concept of Islam. And they who guard their private parts, the concept of Islam. And they who are to their trust and their promises attentive, again the concept of Islam. And they who are carefully to maintain their prayers, again the concept of Islam. So here once again, Allah says that قَدْ أَفْلَحَ الْمُؤْمِنُونَ, those who, the believers, have succeeded. And you know, according to the Quran, like what you see after this are not conditions of the success of the believers. The Quran is saying that the believer has succeeded anyway, without any conditions, because what is following is just a description of what is a believer and is not a condition. Because the true because the Quran, when the Quran talks about the believer, it talks about the true believer, and is not talking. So it's talking about an ideal. So the true believer, anyhow, in all cases, he has succeeded, because what is a true believer? Is the one who contemplates in his prayer, who stays away from ill speech, who gives zakat, etc., etc. So those are just descriptions of true believers and not condition of true believers. Because anyhow, like I said, the Quran always talks about the ideal and not giving condition to be a true believer. And so we see that all of those elements, true belief encompasses all of those elements of ihsan and Islam and iman, like we said before. So the epistemology of Quranic ethics, if we go back to what we said before, we can say that ethics, according to the Quran, can mean different things. It can mean ethics as a human innate essence, the fitra, because human is initially ethical, because it's a divine insufflation, and a human being is ethical by nature. Or ethics as a divine universal order, because God created everything according to the good. And this is what you find in different verses in the Quran also. خَلَقَ السَّمَاوَاتِ وَالْأَرْضَ بِالْحَقِّ, He created the heavens and the earth, so the universe, with the good, or with the truth. And the truth here is the good, like we see in other verses. Or ethics as a revelation, and the revelation also came with the good and with the truth. وَبِالْحَقِّ أَنزَلْنَاهُ وَبِالْحَقِّ نَزَلْ, the same truth and the same good is also to be found in the revelation. We have other verses where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Allahu alladhi أنزل الكتاب بالحق والميزان. So God, He is the one who has revealed the book with the truth, or who has sent down the book with the truth, and He has sent down the balance, the mizan, with the truth also. So the balance, the book has been sent down with the truth, so with the good, and the balance also has been sent down with the good, and the balance is related to the universe. It's something that relates to the universe, because we find this in another verse. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَالسَّمَاءَ رَفَعَهَا وَوَضَعَ الْمِيزَانِ, He has elevated the sky, the heaven, and He established the mizan, the balance. أَلَّا تَطْغَوْا فِي الْمِيزَانِ, that you will not transgress the balance. So which means that initially the universe is good, and the human being, his initial function is not to initiate good in the universe because it's already there. It's to not transgress the good that is in the universe. This is the initial function of the human being. And then we have ethics as a science, or sciences, which are actually which is a human endeavor to articulate those three first elements and to, theoretically and then also practically. So ethics as a science, or as sciences, are human endeavors to articulate divine ethics and to articulate human ethics and to articulate universal ethics as a universal order and as a revelation into, human thought and human practice. And so we can conclude out of this, that Islamic sciences has an ethical function. Their function is of ethical nature. So we can categorize, according to this, we can categorize Islamic sciences into three main categories: sciences of ethics as a subject. So here we have ethics as a science that studies global meanings and higher values, ideals, and objectives. So here we have theology, for instance. And then ethics as a science that is concerned with the innate reality of man and the initiation of the soul to incarnate higher values. Here we have the discipline of Sufism and spirituality. And ethics as a science that examines the obligations emerging from the higher ideals and that contribute to their practical achievement. And here we have the discipline or the science of fiqh. And then science of methodology of ethics, which are sciences which investigate the mechanism of deduction of ethics from its sources, the criteria of its evaluation and classification, and its applied mechanism. And here we have different sciences like usul al-fiqh, science of methodology of fiqh, and we can have Quran sciences and different other disciplines, qawa'id al-fiqhiyya, etc. And then we have sciences that study the sources of ethics, sciences that study the founding text in terms of transmission and authentication. So here we can have, hadith sciences, and we can have also some parts of Quranic sciences, etc. So with this, we can actually categorize all Islamic sciences within those categories, those three main categories, which means that actually, in a way or another, all Islamic sciences are sciences of ethics, actually. And the three main Islamic sciences, which are theology or aqidah and fiqh and spirituality, actually are addressing ethics as a subject. So they are a direct articulation of ethics, while the others are there to support those three sciences. So here, with this classification, we can once again categorize all Islamic sciences within actually the sphere of ethics. And in this way, actually, we can see that there is a major issue in the Islamic tradition, because, like I said, once again, ethics has been pushed to a secondary status within Islamic sciences. So Islamic Ethicotheology and the imperative to reconcile Islamic sciences with their ontological function. So we have seen that the ontological function of Islamic sciences, because we have seen that Islamic ethics are, those three main components, so divine ethics and human ethics. We have seen that divine ethics articulates through the universe. Divine ethics articulates within God's creation. Divine ethics articulates in the human being, how human is initially or intrinsically. And divine ethics articulates throughout revelation. And so Islamic sciences are just a human endeavor to articulate this divine ethics into human conception and behavior. This is Islamic ethics, those are Islamic sciences. In a way or another, they are contributing to articulating divine ethics into human conception or human behavior. This is the ontological function of Islamic sciences. Now, if we look at the reality of Islamic sciences, once again, we see that Islamic ethics got a secondary role for historical reasons, and we see also that there is this interconnection that should be there between Islamic sciences, because there is an initial interconnection between, like we saw, Iman and Islam and Ihsan. One cannot function without the other. And we see, for instance, that there is no interconnection between fiqh and aqidah and spirituality. Even more, if you read usul al-fiqh, a lot of scholars will even tell you that somebody who is performing fiqh is not, he is not obliged to know aqidah. He is not obliged to study aqidah, to study creed. So there is a fragmentation between the sciences. Not only fragmentation, but there is, for instance, when we take theology, we said it before, theology ended up to be a science that is there to reply to the opponent, and not to frame the human behavior ethically, and not to provide a way to articulate, divine ethics into human behavior. Because theology, at the end of the day, its main concern is divine ethics, God and His attributes, etc. And this divine ethics should be articulated into human spiritual ethics and into human practical ethics. But this has not been the case in Islamic history, because ethics, like I said, was marginalized, and because there is this interruption between this fragmentation between the sciences. So what we try to do here is to highlight, or to try to demonstrate, the ontology and the genealogy of Islamic ethics within revelation, and the need, to reassess Islamic sciences on that basis. So this should be the criteria, this should be the parameter on which we reassess Islamic sciences. Because often the problem when reassessing Islamic sciences, when you read works that try to reassess Islamic sciences, they don't reassess Islamic sciences on an ontological epistemology, which means on a parameter that is, or on a definition of Islamic sciences according to how they are required according to revelation. But Islamic sciences are assessed according to the definition they got throughout history. And this is the main issue. So we should go back to the ontological function of Islamic sciences, which is an ethical function, to reassess Islamic sciences on that basis. Wallahu a'lam wa ahkam. Wa akhiru da'wana alhamdulillahi rabbil alameen.